When I think about pride and what it means to be queer, as someone who has been identifying as part of the LGBTQ plus community in some way, shape, or form for nearly half of my life, what comes to mind most is community and the importance of community. I count myself very lucky that my sense of community as a youth and as a queer person has largely overlapped with my UU community. This is a very precious experience for me, and I know it can be rare. Religion and spiritual places can too often be sites of struggle for queer folks. And so I really do count my blessings that growing up I had support that came from so many angles. I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you a bit more about myself, my story, and my journey through Unitarian Universalism and through queerness. My name is Nim. As Fiona mentioned, I go by he, they, them, or he, him pronouns, but I haven't always known this about myself. Some of you may have known me differently from when I was a kid. I grew up attending UCM, and it feels very good to be back. When I was growing up, it was called UCSP, and I moved through the Sunflowers to the Holy Cows and finally to the youth group. I really found my community in the youth group and through other UU youth events. I'm sure for many people, their teen years can be hard, and for me, it was no exception. My closest friends and allies came from UU youth, especially at cons and at Unicamp, and among other things in my life as I moved through my discovery of my own gender and sexuality. UU events were one of the first places where I felt I was able to be myself fully. I knew that I was queer at least as young as 12 when I had the language for it, and when I first came out to my best friend at the time. But the real fun began a few years later when I started questioning my gender. I can actually pinpoint the exact time I first realized that I was maybe a bit different. I was at a Canoodle, the youth event in Ottawa. Usually takes place around now anyways, in May. I was probably about 14 or 15 years old, and as part of Canoodle, everyone has a name tag, and we were all encouraged to put our pronouns on our name tags. And I realized that I didn't want to put she, her, which is how I had been referred to my whole life up to that point. I think that's probably the first time I realized that she, her pronouns just didn't describe me. At the time, I didn't know what to put down at all. I just knew there was a disconnect. That weekend was the first time that I told someone that my gender didn't feel right. I pulled my friend aside at one point in the weekend and said, I don't know what pronouns to put on my name tag. She, her just doesn't feel right anymore. My friend was very supportive as I would discover all of my UU friends to be. And even just telling someone how I felt like a huge weight off my shoulders. I still didn't know what pronouns I would want instead or what this might mean or what was going on. I was a teenager, but I knew that at least I didn't have to figure it out. I continued to think about this pronoun question over the next few years to try to make sense of it all. The tricky part that I found about exploring my gender is it's all so subjective. Gender is really what you make of it. And lots of people go through life and never really think about their gender because the way people describe them has always been correct. For myself, the way people were describing me, calling me she, a girl, a woman, it just didn't fit. Once I realized it didn't fit, I saw it everywhere. Every interaction, I became hyper aware of gender, of how people were perceiving me, how they were treating me as a result, what I could do to make it fit. I had a lot of really hard days. It's hard to do anything when it feels like the world doesn't see you. Doesn't see you for who you are. My UU community was one of the first places where I felt I could just show up and exist. I didn't have to explain. Sorry. I didn't have to explain myself or worry about whether people would judge me. We were able to just be teens and hang out. When I finally found language that described me and my gender, I first told people at these UU events. Many of my first coming out moments happened in the sanctuaries of UU churches. I attribute a large part of that to how open and normalized sharing pronouns was. At large events, we were always encouraged to put our pronouns on our name tags. In smaller events, we often shared our pronouns along with our names when we introduced ourselves. Early in my gender journey, much of my stress and my anxiety came from not knowing how people would perceive me. Strangers and even people I knew would call me she or her, either based on my appearance or just because they had always referred to me that way. I found it very intimidating to correct people who might not even know that they were saying something wrong. Being encouraged to share my pronouns at UU events, and just as importantly, being in groups where people would respect those pronouns was very important and precious to me. When I started using different pronouns like he, him, or they, them, it was like a puzzle piece clicked into place. It just felt right. The first time somebody used the right pronouns for me, I couldn't help but smile. It's very hard to describe. It was like a weight was lifted off my chest, like a small flower inside of me was able to bloom again. For a while, the only place where people used the right pronouns or name for me was at UU events. In other parts of my life, I felt like I was playing a caricature of other people's expectations, like a part in a play. UU events became times I looked forward to where I could be myself and be around people who I felt truly understood me. I do not think I could have flourished the way that I did without having those spaces. When I was 17, I started coming out to more people in my life outside of just UU events. I told my parents, who've both been as wonderful and as supportive as I could have ever dreamed. I told the rest of my family as well, who've also been lovely. I also started coming out to a few people at high school and then fully when I went to university later. Coming out to new people was and sometimes continues to be a very scary experience. I'm never quite sure how people will react. I was afraid that people would not understand, that people would not care, or that people would react negatively. But I was encouraged by the fact that I already had all of these people, all of these Unitarian youth who knew that I was trans and who supported me and loved me for who I was. I am very blessed that my family has been supportive of me. Even if some did not understand it at first, they love me enough to learn more about it and why it is important to me. I'm so lucky to have a partner who's been with me through thick and thin and always makes me feel safe and wanted. These are things that other trans or queer youth may not realize that they can have, but my UU community always made me feel supported and hopeful for the future. Coming out as trans, having people know me, be able to use the right pronouns for me, has been a life-saving experience. I'm able to be myself fully and feel like the world makes sense to me again. On my bad days as a teen, still trying to make sense of my gender and my feelings, the world often felt cold and strangely foreign. I sometimes didn't know how I would ever feel like I belonged, or what my place in the world could be. Luckily, I didn't feel like that when I was around my friends. For the weekend that the con lasted, or the week that I was at uni camp, the rest of the world drifted away, and I could just be present around people who treated me with kindness. And luckily, because of the support and encouragement of my UU community, I was able to make sense of things, to come out and to be able to bring my full self to the table. Lots of the UU friends I made were more than just supportive. Many of them were having similar feelings themselves, so we didn't always know that was the case. Many of my friends at the time or since then have come out to me. It has always amazed me that as queer people, we were drawn together as youth before many of us even knew that about ourselves. In my friends and my UU community, I was able to find a home. And that can be really hard for a young queer, gangly trans kid just trying to figure things out. A lot of life can be hard when you're trans, but my UU circle was making things easier. I really was made to feel like I belonged and like I mattered. I do not feel like I have to withhold parts of myself in order to be accepted. And that has made all the